So hi guys, I'm Shivani. I'm hosting this afternoon's sessions. So the first session is from Tista, who's from the GMC, and she'll be taking a really informative session on how to ace the SJT. So thank you, Tista.
Thanks very much, Shivani, and welcome everyone. Really good to be here with you. I've been coming to this conference for a while, and face-to-face is lovely, but I'm glad I can be with you in some form. Okay, so as Shivani says, we're going to be looking at SJTs today, and my aims really, I won't read all of this out, you can read it yourself. Just pause. But my sort of primary aim is to go through a number of practice questions with you and explore how GMP, so good medical practice, applies, and then where your resources are. We only have 45 minutes today. I'd normally do this for 90 minutes or indeed longer, so it's important that we signpost you as well. So before getting started with all of that, just by way of brief introduction for those that don't know me, so I'm Tista, and I have been in and around healthcare for nearly 25 years, which is slightly scary. I work with survivors of abuse in sexual assault referral centres, in psychological therapies, and I still do that work. And about 10 years ago, a little bit more now actually, I was asked to join the GMC to set up a support service for doctors on the ground, students on the ground. And I remember at the time being really, really excited, thinking this is a really progressive thing for a regulator to do, because having been in the system for a while, I've not seen anything like this. So I was very excited and thought this is a great way of removing that distance and actually hearing and getting input from on the ground. And then at one of my very first conferences, it was a GP conference, I was introduced onto the conference podium to the theme of the Imperial March, Darth Vader's theme tune, for those that don't know. And you know, they were really enterprising. They'd embedded it into their PowerPoint, their introduction sort of PowerPoint. And that moment for me just kind of crystallized just what fear we can be beheld in, and I completely understand why we are thought of predominantly in fitness to practice terms. But as I learned more about the GMC in my early days of working there, it became really apparent to me that of all the statutory functions that are there on this slide, that there in the centre, standards, is the absolute fulcrum of what we do. And I would argue that standards is more important in many ways for patient safety than fitness to practice, because the really serious fitness to practice stuff applies to such a tiny minority. So the goal really is the more that we can do to help colleagues on the ground to deliver, let's face it, challenging standards in an increasingly challenging environment, and that was pre-pandemic, well, that is morally the right thing to do. So my team are available at regional, national, at local level across the country. We are the outreach team. And this is what we do. So wherever you are, there is a point of contact. And you can just find that on our website under GMC Outreach. So we're running this session today, which is great. It's a bit of a taster, but if it would be useful to have more at your med school or in the future, then please do get in touch. So that's a brief introduction. And now let's have a look at SJTs. And Shivana, can I ask you to launch the first question, please?
Yeah, that's been launched.
Marvellous. So we'll have a look at your immediate thoughts on what worries you about SJTs, and we'll try and explore some of that today with our practice. So if you haven't already, just go into the Slido in the Q&A and polls and type in a word, a phrase on what worries you. I can see some answers coming through. And I'll give it a bit longer. Right, let's see. Yeah, we've got a number of responses there. The unknown. Variation in opinion, I think that is a really, really important one. Yeah, just not being sure on how to prepare. Subjective. Yes, this again, another really, really important one. Some of the questions that I've seen in past SJTs, to put it mildly, concern me. But the more recent past papers I've seen are an improvement, but I plan to talk about that a little bit anyway, and what resources to use, absolutely. So we will be covering that. Okay, great, thank you. So let's start off with what resources to use. Good medical practice, and when I say good medical practice, it's not just the purple booklet there in the top centre. It is all of the explanatory guidance that goes along with it. And sometimes we get the fairly common refrain that isn't good medical practice, common sense. And I've heard clinical tutors, in fact, say this themselves in teaching sessions, that, yeah, it's common sense. And I agree that a number of areas, when you read them as is in the guidance, do indeed appear to be common sense. But actually, this next slide, which I don't expect you to try and read, that's the point of it. This is a list of every single piece of legislation that we distilled to put into just one piece of guidance, in this case, the confidentiality guidance a few years ago. And you would actually need to know all of these areas of legislation, which is impossible and ridiculous to keep up with. And that's what our ethical policy teams do. They look at the wider ethical framework, take out the salient bits to medical practice from legislation and put it into a more digestible document for you. And that means that good medical practice forms the benchmark for practice, not just best practice, but the benchmark for practice, and also a safety net for decision making. That safety net for you. So good medical practice is the primary resource, and as I say, the documents that go along with it. Now, what you may also be aware of is that we have a number of scenarios on our website. So great, you've got all of those pieces of guidance there, but you need to make those standards, those guidance areas real. And consequently, we've got loads and loads of case studies, interactive scenarios, and use those, particularly those scenarios, because they are written in a way that I think is helpful to SJTs. It gives you the dilemma, and then it talks you through the thinking process, if you will, that decision-making framework, and then comes to an answer, which it then explains. And that is somewhat similar to SJTs. And whilst we don't own SJTs, I have seen an increasing alignment, which is helpful. So let's get started with some practice, and then we'll come back to resources a bit later. So my first question for you, I'll let you read the vignette. So Dr. Prava, she sustains a needle stick injury from Jolie. So this is the question, and Shivana, if you can launch the poll if you haven't already.
ready.
Marvellous, thank you. And I'll give you a few moments. And this is the thing with SJTs, you need a bit of thinking time to do the ranking in the right order and things like that. And when you're going through each option, think, okay, this is the one that's ridiculous, so I can ignore that. Yeah. Narrow it down. So what do we think? I can see some answers coming through. Right, so we can see some answers now. I think you can see the polls. Okay. Great. Yeah, the majority have it. So hopefully that provides some reassurance as you can see the polls coming in there. The majority absolutely have it now. Let's run through it. So I'll just go back to my slide view. It is B, D, and C. And the reasons for that, and this is where the standards, which we would, if we had longer, we would explore this in detail with you. But the standards that are relevant here are around consent, around shared decision making. And the other bit is around communication with colleagues. So in the room, in the moment, it can be very, very challenging around those relationships with your colleagues. So if it is possible, you would go with B to try and have that word privately, signpost to the relevant trust policy, and then look at further training for the team. And the guidance just highlights the fact that going ahead, of course, would be battery. So what can you do in that moment to try and prevent the situation and improve learning for the team? So that is the thinking around this one. And I will be looking at chat and any questions for follow-up as well. So I will keep an eye on that, but we'll just move to the next one. And I'll let you read this. So you'll all be thinking around the issues that, of course, Amy does need to be tested. And how do we get to that point? So the question around this, which of these two are the most appropriate? We can launch that. I can see the answers coming in. And we've got a load of answers coming in with this one now. So shall we go to the results, see where we're at? Yeah, okay. Yeah, absolutely. So oh, look at the results. It is indeed B and C. And this one isn't in order of preference, it's just the two most appropriate because, and the thing is with SJTs, some of the questions, as I've indicated, and as you've said, when we asked you the first question on worries, there are areas that feel subjective. And some of those questions that I've seen in past papers, I've thought, it depends on how you interpret it. But with the vast majority, they're like this. This is what you would be thinking you would want to do anyway. And you can find that the most appropriate options do align with that. Okay. And the guidance around this, if it is useful for you to have a check around that, yes, there's child protection guidance, yes, there's confidentiality guidance. Some of the additional resources, however, that I find really helpful, we have a decision-making flowchart around child protection, and that's just a quick aid memoir of the steps that you would take given the scenario, and that aligns perfectly with Farah and Amy's scenario here. And for those that are interested more broadly, and I've done quite a bit of work in this area, I find the guidance from this collaborative piece from Viva Bash and Shiva really, really useful around HIV and support for children. But in terms of the SJT question itself, it is that previous resource that helps around child protection in particular, so that you know that you're following the right process. Okay. So moving on to the next scenario, meet Sally. So Sally's in for a termination of pregnancy. And when a mum steps out of the room, it's really, really clear that Sally is anxious, and she's saying things like, I would have made a great mum, etc. Okay. So let's go to the two most appropriate again. So if we launch the poll for that. Bear in mind, think first what you would actually do and then look at the answers. I'll give you a few more moments and I will check the Q&A whilst you're typing in. Okay, brill. We've got a load of answers now, so let's have a look at the results. Okay, so absolutely, you should be having that more detailed conversation with Sally alone, because you want to understand her thinking. Now let's look at what we would say. So as you've all done, you'd want to have that more detailed conversation with Sally, and that increases your understanding. The second consideration in this scenario is we're concerned that someone just wants to go ahead, that someone is misinterpreting what best interest means and how it applies. And that is why we go with B as well. And it would, it might be educational supervisor, it might be clinical supervisor. In this question, it happens to mention Reg, but yes, you would speak with someone to get an assist on the fact that we're seeing that policy, guidance, standards, etc. aren't being followed. And, you've gathered all of this already is implicit. Consent needs to be voluntary. It needs to be given freely. Informed consent means a conversation. And one of the things that we see far too often in healthcare is a presumption of incapacity rather than a presumption of capacity. And we sometimes see this with those who qualified a while ago before the Mental Capacity Act was properly implemented. But you will be, through your current education, very familiar that we are looking at a specific decision and the patient's ability to understand, weigh, retain, communicate for that specific decision. And again, all of this is within the standards, the guidance around it. Okay, so moving on to the next one, I'll let you digest this. And I have seen in all papers that, well, the vast majority of past papers I've seen, there is something around gifts. And in fact, this is one that's directly lifted. This particular question, it's an old past paper. Here are the options, so rank them all. And I'll give you a few moments to do that. And this is the style of question that I'm seeing less and less of, happily, because there's a lot of thinking time in terms of ranking them all. And my personal view is that this has a bit of a red herring in it as well, if that helps with your thinking when ranking this. And it aligns with a couple of the questions and chat that I've seen as well, in terms of there are answers sometimes in SJTs that that are poor practice, or that are almost trickery because they don't provide the full context. And I appreciate your concerns around that, very much so. But as I say, the more recent past papers are a lot better in their rationale. Okay, so we have a number of responses now. So shall we have a look at, okay. Yeah, these are, these are virtually absolutely in line with what we would expect. The red herring, however, comes into play. So you've gotten exactly what we would say at the GMC. And this is where I get annoyed with the past papers, because their actual answer was everything you've said, but their top answer was actually E. And the rationale in the paper was thanking is just polite and doesn't follow that you're going to accept it. And that is hugely frustrating, because when I read that, I think that means thank you, I've taken it, I've accepted it. But like I say, the recent papers don't have this kind of trickery in. I have put it in there just in case we see anything like this. You see anything like this again, just think through what the full context might mean. But you've all gotten the rest in order. So all of the rest of it is eminently logical. Okay, so moving on. And again, this is a real one, which is eminently logical in my view. Think what you would actually do. And then I'll show you the responses and make them match with what you would actually do. And this aligns with a couple of the questions or comments in the chat, that there are sometimes options that are just really poor, and does that inadvertently promote poor practice? And with these ranking questions, that is the problem. You need to be clear that there are terrible options. They're not ones that you're actually going to do. So just rank those at the bottom. Okay, we've got a load of responses in. So let's have a look at what we've got here. And I'll just load up the answers and look at your answers at the same time. Okay. So, yeah, absolutely. The majority have got it. Yeah. 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 So, as you can see, with the types of questions that we are seeing now in SJT, they align with your logical thinking. So that is positive and hopefully reassuring. So moving on, slightly different question where we're going to, just to break it up a little bit, just do 3 answers, but I'll let you read the scenario. So with this one, what are your immediate thoughts? Yes, you can do it. No, you can't. Are alternatives available? Just type in. Right. Okay, let's have a look at your thinking then on this one. Yeah, absolutely. You've all got it there. In this scenario, you refrain from prescribing, you can't do it because there is time. There is time for other options here. The standards on this is that you, wherever possible, so unless it is an emergency situation, wherever possible, you must not prescribe for friends or family, and this is a partner. And there are other options available given that she's got time to get, pharmacists can do emergency prescriptions, etc. Out of hours, this is what out of hours do all the time. So what you do, you think of your answer like you have, and then you would align it with any ranking or whatever comes up on your SJT. Okay. Right, so let's look at another scenario. And this kind of scenario, again, this is lifted from a real one, and it's very common that delegation, inappropriate delegation, working outside your competence, this is a theme that comes up a lot as well. So this is another thing to bear in mind, the types of themes that come up. So I've mentioned this one. I've mentioned working relationships. So patient safety issue plus working relationships can often be combined. So you're looking at how do I resolve the patient safety issue plus how do I do that in a way that best manages working relationships through good communication skills, appropriate escalation, etc. So let's have a look at what the question said. It wants you to rank. So this time you're ranking fully. So if there is anything in there that you think is completely ridiculous, remember that goes last, of course, and it is not promoting, although I can see why we feel these shouldn't be included at all. Okay. I think we are there or thereabouts. We've got a load of answers in. And let's just show the results and see how they align with yours. So, yeah, absolutely. As you can see, your first port of call is informing the consultant. Now, if you can't, the next is indeed find another colleague. Then it is finding a senior colleague, and then it's getting into really into territory we would not want to go into. And we wouldn't at the GMC advise you to, which is why I say that there has been historically a disconnect sometimes with some of the SJT responses, but you've identified it is not a good response. C, and then finally worst possible is A. Okay. So again, hopefully reassuring, because you are absolutely getting these through logical thinking. So now let's look at Mr. Baker. And again, this is a real one from a past paper. So do your thinking now. What are you going, what are the problems that it's looking at? It's looking at, as I was saying, patient safety and relationships with colleagues. Okay. So what would you do in reality? And now let's look at the options it gives you and align your reality with three most appropriate. And I have to say, this one, it's got so many options, it's absolutely ridiculous. So dismiss the ones that are ridiculous because you only have to choose three. Right, we're getting loads of answers in now. So let's look at the results and see how they align with yours. Yeah, absolutely. Ask the F1. Yeah. Yeah. Discuss. Take Mr. Baker's blood yourself. Let's see where I'm up to. There are so many, aren't there? And G. Okay. So the majority have it here. But there are a couple of answers that you've voted for that don't make it into the top. So the take Mr. Baker's blood yourself, the thinking there, the reason that that is not one of the top three is because of the unsustainability. And in the ideal scenario, you want to be ensuring his safety. So you're doing that by speaking to the F1, taking over your shift. You are entitled. We know that in reality with workload, it is extremely difficult, but the system wants to get to a place where you are not working additional hours. And some of you may be aware of exception reporting, and the system are really keen that you do exception report if you are made to stay, extra hours. So the ideal, therefore, would be to avoid that. And the options here, you've ensured safety and you have escalated the issue by discussing with the nurse in charge, and next day also looking at the communication issue, so which you've all identified appropriately there. Okay. So, and that aligns with our standards on raising concerns, workload, etc. Right. So, moving on to, I think, our last one, if not penultimate, and then we can look at any questions. Right. So I'll let you read that. And this time there are 3 questions associated with this that we're going to go through. So can we launch the first one, please, Shivani? Okay, we've got a load of answers flooding in, so let's have a look at that. Okay. Yeah, brilliant. No unless other victim. Yeah. So when the SJT question is revealed, if something like this is used in SJTs, and I've seen similar, then you've already got that in mind. And it is a no. When you have a competent adult and there isn't anyone else present, then there are no wider safeguarding concerns, then you don't breach their confidentiality unless you think that there is immediate threat to life. Okay, and that's how it's defined in the Care Act 2014, and is clear again in the confidentiality standards around that. So let's look at the next question on this scenario, and I'll explain it all in a bit more detail after we finish the final question. And look at the wording here carefully. Do you have to disclose the status of a GP? Okay, let's look at the responses. And again, brilliant. The majority have it. No, you don't have to. Ideally, you would want to get to a place where she's happy for you to disclose. And there are other things that you can do. If she is adamant, of course, that she doesn't want to disclose, then as per the standards, as per the law, as per the guidance, then you can't. But you can perhaps explain to her that GP has the same duty of confidentiality as you, provide that reassurance, and alternatively, perhaps even suggest that she changes GP if she doesn't have that confidence in her or him, So there are other things that you would do in if you had Talia in front of you, but the bottom line standard is that you can't if she is adamant. So then the final question, let's launch that. And this, in a way, is the most challenging of all. And again, we've got a flood of answers coming in. So should we have a look at the results? And I'll talk us through this. And then that should just about give us enough time to pick up some of the Q&A I've not managed to respond in between. Okay, right. The majority have said yes. Now, the wording of the question again was, must you arrange partner notification? No, you don't have to. Now, in most scenarios you would, but let's think about this wider scenario, bringing Talia back as a whole person. There are lots and lots of complexities here, and you will be worrying about the domestic violence as well. And when you're looking at sharing information, the standards look at, have you got consent? That's the obvious one. Then, of course, you can share information. Is there any law that compels you to? No, in this case, there is not, which surprises some people. But as I say, the confidentiality guidance looks at this. And then the final thing is it in the public interest, which I'll explore in a moment. And that, if you will, consent law, public interest, someone turned that into a bit of a mnemonic, which is somewhat hilarious when you're talking about gum, but I won't say anything else about that. But it is useful just as an aid memoir, that is the algorithm, if you will, for thinking about whether you're going to disclose information. So the public interest test is what you're left with in this scenario. And that is where you are weighing the benefits to an individual society, in this case, Talia's partner, or wider society, because they both may be sleeping with other people, for example, versus, in this case, the harm to her. This time he might kill her, for example. There is something else that you have to consider in the public interest test, and that is that wider public interest in having a confidential medical service. And that has been a tenet of medical practice since way back when, right, going back to Hippocrates, it is there. And that is essentially, if a service, whether it is a GP practice, whether it is a sexual health clinic, whether it is a sexual assault referral centre, if that service gets a reputation, doctors get a reputation for being leaky with confidential information, then people might stop presenting. And that's why it's a central tenet. So that's why the thinking is always in these scenarios, work with the patient rather than breach confidentiality. There are some instances where that benefits to individuals or society will outweigh that, but it is every scenario that is in front of you, every patient that is in front of you, different factors will weigh in. And in Talia's, as you identified, if there is a child present, given the complexity, that changes things. If a viral load is 0, that changes things. And in the ideal, what you would want to do, a bit like Farah and Amy, is work with Talia over a bit of time, get her maybe to a place where she is safe, safeguarding are involved, and it might take a bit of time to build that trust, but if you can do that over a period of a few months, then you can arrange partner notification. But the bottom line, as the standards make clear, is that you don't have to. So one thing that's come up as a theme in the chat and the Q&A is additional resources, and I've mentioned that there's loads on the website, and this is an example of one of the scenarios on the GMC website, so access that. Flowcharts are available there. This one is, I showed you the child protection one. This is around decision making. There's e-learning. There are specific topic areas. So there is loads there, but my primary one would be having a play with the scenarios there. I've also included a link to past papers, and these are the recent past papers. So it's incredibly, incredibly useful to avail yourselves of that resource. And that that is your sort of key tool to prep: past papers and the scenarios on the GMC website. We're just over time, so I'm just going to give you my final takeaways, and that is, as we've said, look at the scenario and think what you would do in the ideal reality, and then look at the responses and align them with what you think you would have done anyway. And that is the best approach to the questions in front of you that we find help most people. I think that covers most of it. There were a couple of questions about the specific scenarios. It's easy for me to say the answers are in the guidance, but I'm really, really happy to answer those. So please do message me, because I am conscious that we're over time if there's something that you want to explore. But for each scenario, do just look at the specific standards around it as well. And remember that they often use confidentiality, patient safety, working with colleagues, gifts. They will, or delegation and working outside competence. So they're top areas as well to focus in on. Hope that was helpful. Very whistle-stop tour, which is why I'm very happy to speak with you offline as well. Thank you very much for your time.
That was great. Thank you so much, Tista.